Today we're going to continue our study of factoring by grouping. So we learned previously that when we need to factor by grouping, there are certain necessary conditions. We need to have 4 or more terms, and those terms have to have common factors. And when we factor out a greatest common factor, we need to make sure that we have identical common factors remaining, and that's really important. And you can see here is this procedure that we've utilized and that we've referenced in our previous video and that we've referenced in class. And we're going to do that today. Now, the only difference here is that we're going to end up with factors that are not quite identical. So we need to take some slight extra steps to help us figure out what to do when the remaining common factors are not quite identical, but that they look very similar. So before we can jump into factoring by grouping when we don't have quite identical common factors, we need to address something. We need to determine or understand what an additive inverse is. And you probably have heard this term before, but we need to remember that inverse or additive inverse is like the opposite. And so if I were to ask you the opposite of positive 12, you would probably easily come up with negative 12. And if I were to tell you what's the opposite or ask you what's the opposite of negative 54, you could probably tell me that it's positive 54. And similarly, you could probably tell me that the additive inverse or the opposite of x would be negative x. So all we're doing here is really changing the sign, taking the opposite. But it gets a little bit trickier when we have these binomials here. So what we really can do, again, is we're changing the sign, but we need to change the sign of everything in that parentheses. So if I were to change the sign of everything in the parentheses, I would get something like negative x plus 5. And what I've essentially done is multiplied by negative 1. And I can rewrite this negative x plus 5 as 5 take away x. They're the same thing. I've just rearranged the order. So these two are the same, but they are not the same as x take away 5. These two are inverses of x take away 5. So if I were to deal with y plus 7 and I would multiply it by negative 1, and use the distributive property, I would get negative y minus 7. And I could, of course, rearrange that as negative 7 minus y as well. So you need to be able to recognize the difference. So if we are just to continue and to imagine we were just factoring by grouping and not really coming up with anything different here, if I were going to factor, I would maybe pick the first 2 terms to group together and the second 2 terms to group together. So if I were going to group and factor, my greatest common factor here of 2mk minus 12m is going to be 2m. And when I factor the 2m out, I'll get k minus 6. And then I put my plus sign, and now I'm going to find the greatest common factor of 42 minus 7k, which happens to just be 7. And I'm going to factor out that 7, so 42 divided by 7 is 6, and negative 7k divided by 7 is negative k. Now, if you notice, these are the 2 terms that need to be the same, and they're not. They are reversed. The k here is negative, and this 6 here is positive. They are additive inverses of one another. So to make them the same, I need to factor out a negative 1 in order to make them look exactly alike. So if I factor out a negative 1 from 6 take away k, well, 6 divided by negative 1 is negative 6, and negative k divided by negative 1 is positive k. Now, I can rewrite this piece right here as k take away 6, and now I'm matching this guy here. So I'm just going to rewrite 2m times k minus 6 plus 7. Now I'm going to include that negative 1, and I'm going to rewrite 6 minus k now as k minus 6. So all I did to make these two pieces the same was factor out a -1 from one of them. So again, I bring down my 2m and my k minus 6 here. And now my 7 times -1 is something I do. So I'm going to make that my minus 7, k minus 6. And now we're back to how we know how to factor by grouping. I bring down my k minus 6, and I bring down my 2m minus 7. And that's our final answer. So the only difference here was factoring out a -1. Okay, let's try number 2. Again, our procedure tells us first to group terms with common factors. I'll try the first two and the second two together. So in my group of my first group here, my common factor is C, and when I factor out a C, I get 1 take away 2D. Plus, in my second group, my common factor is 4, and when I factor out a 4, I get 2D minus 1. So again, you'll notice that these two guys are not the same. They are backwards. So they are additive inverses. So I need to factor out a -1 from one of them. So I'll bring down my C, 1 minus 2D, plus 4. And now I'm factoring out the -1. And when I factor out the -1, I'm going to come up here or come down here and do it. -1, and the 2D becomes -2D. Oh, -2D. And the -1 becomes +1. So I can rewrite this now as 1 minus 2D. So I now write it as 1 minus 2D. I just rearranged it from here. And now I have my C times 1 minus 2D. I bring it down. I didn't touch it. My 4 times -1 becomes -4. And now I bring down my common factor of 1 minus 2D. I bring down my 1 minus 2D because it's the common factor, and I rewrite my leftovers as C take away 4. And that is our final answer. Again, the only difference, doing this -1 business. Okay, here is the did you get it? Again, when you find additive inverses, factor out a -1, and you will be fine. Okay, this answer will be posted tomorrow. Do your best on this, and we will work on it more in class. Have a good one.